Okay, hello again, Ling 201. We're going to walk through a couple of phonology lectures tonight, hopefully. The first of which is on syllable structure. And once you watch these lectures, you should be good to go for the homework. Although, like I said before, I am going to post one about the second set of practice exercises so you get a better hang on how to work with distinctive features when you're writing up phonological rules. So I still haven't done that one. Hopefully I'll do it tomorrow morning. But this should get you started on the other parts of the homework. I'm going to mention as well, before you watch this video, please take a shot at doing this quick write number 18 on syllable structure. I mentioned in an email that you don't have to show me where you think the syllable boundaries are between the syllables and these various words, but it's a good idea to try to work on that on your own because it'll lead into a lot of things I talk about in this lecture. Okay, so give that a shot and I'll walk you through these lecture notes. Okay, so something I told you a very long time ago is that there are some strings of English words which don't sound like they could possibly be English words. So it's funny to think about this because so much has happened in the meantime, but this is something I talked about on the very first day of class way back in January. But there are possible English words like plab, forch, beag, shump, stas, so on and so forth. These are not actual English words, but they could be if you wanted to create a product for whatever reason that was called Krong. Maybe you could. I don't know what you'd be selling under that name, but use your imagination. There are, however, unpossible or impossible English words like fmort, ksik, rmak, msile, so on and so forth. Like you would not actually produce any sort of product named notch with a engma, a velar nasal at the beginning of the word. And today we're going to try to figure out why that's the case. And basically, the moral of the story is that the unpossible English words here violate what are called the phonotactic rules of the language. So we've talked a lot about how things change in phonology, how you go from like a phonemic representation to a phonetic representation. There are also patterns that we see in phonology where things aren't exactly changing. You just never see the violations of the rules. So in the phonological rules we've talked about so far, like generally they're kind of showing cases where sounds are trying to avoid certain sequences, which may be difficult to say or perceive, what have you, who knows exactly why. But in this case, the phonotactic rules would just avoid creating the sort of dispreferred sequences of sounds to begin with. They never just enter the language at all. Okay, so the way we understand this is to take a look at syllables and syllable structure. And we're just going to do this for English, although I'll talk a little bit about other languages by the time we get to the end. Okay, so syllables are suprasegmental units. I think you probably have some sense of what a syllable means in English. But basically what they do is they organize segments into minimal-sized utterances in a language. Syllables have three subparts. So they have the onset, the nucleus, and the coda. Sorry, I got the sniffles. I still don't think I'm sick, but it's just the sniffles. So I'm sorry if this is not 100% as perfect as you or I might like it to be. Anyways, besides the health issue of everybody, syllables have three subparts: onset, nucleus, and coda. As you might imagine, onset is at the beginning, nucleus is in the middle, coda is at the end. Together, there's an additional structure we call the rhyme, which is the nucleus and the coda together. So I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. You should also be able to find them in the book. Before I get into that, though, I'll tell you that syllables are generally organized around a phonological property called sonority. And sonority is kind of hard to define, but one way to look at it is it's a measure of perceived loudness, or it's sort of an abstraction in our heads in terms of how we perceive how loud a particular sound is. So generally speaking, we talked a little bit about sonorants and obstruents in the last lecture on distinctive features. So sonorants are things that have lots of sonority. So vowels, liquids, nasals, and glides have lots of sonority. They're easy to voice. Things that are not easy to voice, like obstruents, stops, fricatives, affricates, will have less sonority. And the way this factors into how syllables are structured is that the most sonorous segments in a syllable form the peak or the nucleus of the syllable. So vowels will make good peaks. Sonorant consonants like liquids, nasals, or glides are going to be second best. And then obstruents would be really bad. So we've seen a few examples, and we'll see them again in this lecture, where sometimes you can get sonorant consonants in the peak of a syllable, like syllabic R, syllabic L, something like that. So they can factor in that way because they have more sonority than obstruents. In English, obstruents cannot function as the peak of a syllable. You can't get stops or fricatives in the middle of a syllable. It just doesn't work. There are, believe it or not, some languages which can do that, and they've caused a lot of interesting puzzles for phonologists as they try to figure out how these rules work in language throughout the world, but we're not going to get into that. I'm just going to let you know it is possible. It's just very rare. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. So bad is a well-formed syllable in English. A is a vowel, b and d are stops or obstruents. So these have low sonority. The vowel has high sonority. So how do these correspond to the structures we've talking about? Zipping through these. Bland is another example of a well-formed syllable. L and N are sonorous consonant or sonorant consonants. So they have higher sonority than the B or the D, the obstruents, but not quite as high of sonority as the vowel does. So what's nice about this is we get kind of this contour of sonority where it's rising up towards the middle of the syllable and then going down towards the end. That's a well-formed syllable. So this peak in the middle is literally called a sonority peak. That's where you want kind of the center or the anchor of the syllable to be. And then that you can call the nucleus. So sonority peak is a nucleus. And then anything that comes before that sonority peak is the onset. So the blah in bland is the onset of this particular syllable. Anything that comes after it is the coda, the ND part of this. And then also if you want to combine the nucleus and the coda together, you get the rhyme. So and in bland is the rhyme of the syllable. And I think that part is pretty easy to remember because this is the part of the syllable that rhymes with other syllables. So bland rhymes with hand or, I don't know, canned or sand or whatever else you want to come up with. As long as it has this part as being the same, the onset can change and you still get a rhyme. So hopefully that's fairly clear. The way this factors into syllable nuclei. I'll make one point before I go there, and I'll zip back in the slides a little bit. The idea is that the most sonorous segments in a syllable should form the peak or nucleus of a syllable, and we should get this rise from low to high sonority in the middle. There are a few cases in English syllables where there are counterexamples to this that don't entirely fit into this pattern, but we're just, for our purposes, going to ignore this and just work with this kind of idea that we have these three structures in a syllable, along with this combination of nucleus and coda forming the rhyme. Okay, so how does this factor into syllable formation? If you want to figure out how to organize a word into syllables, I'm only going to give you sort of the easiest examples for now in English because, as I mentioned in lecture a week or two ago, there are some ambiguous cases which can cause you some headaches if you really worry about them. Not that we don't have enough to worry about right now as it is. So we'll just leave that to the side as well. But what we want to do is if you see a word and have to figure out how to organize it into syllables, the first thing you should do is, first of all, make a phonetic transcription of the segments in the word. And then out of that phonetic transcription, identify where the syllable nuclei are. So that includes any vowels or syllabic consonants. And I'm going to give you some easy examples here to start off with, and these will only include vowels as the syllabic nuclei. So normally in class, I would just ask people where do they find potential syllable nuclei here. In this case, they're only going to be these four vowels. So this is the word America. We've got four syllables, and not coincidentally, we have four vowels here. So each one of these vowels, schwa, I, and schwa again, is going to form a nucleus of a syllable. So those will project up to these nucleus nodes, which I'm marking with an N, and then those nucleus nodes will project up to a syllable. So these form, like I said, kind of the anchor of the syllable, but that doesn't mean that they're the only thing in the syllable. What do we need to add to them? In this case, it's pretty simple because everything that's left is just a potential onset for one of the syllables. So the way this works is you can kind of form the nucleus or the nuclei of the syllables first, and then each nucleus is going to look to the left to see if it can glom on some sort of onset to that nucleus structure. So we'll grab the onset for the meh in America first. that adds on to that syllable, and this is how you sort of notate that in your transcription. The symbol here, by the way, I forgot to mention, is the Greek letter sigma, which is the way the ancient Greeks said S, or wrote the sound for S. That's why it's there for a syllable, and that's what it represents. So this is going to link up to all the constituents of that syllable, the onset and nucleus in each of these cases. The other syllables work the same way here, the last two. The I grabs the at the beginning, and the schwa grabs the K at its beginning. And now we have a complete structure for syllables for this 4-syllable word, America. This one, you might note, is just by itself. It's only a nucleus, so that's totally fine. Every syllable has to have a nucleus in it. The onsets and the codas are optional. Okay, so phonotactic constraints, I was kind of referring to them earlier. They determine what sounds can be put together to form the different parts of a syllable in a language. So English, we've got a lot of good examples of complex onsets with more than one sound in them. So you could, for instance, get a cl onset like in clean or clamp, or pla like in play or plaque. Interestingly, though, one thing you can't get in English is the sequence tla at the beginning of a syllable. So tle or tlamp are just not allowed. You never find words like that. This is just something that's idiosyncratic to English. There are other languages in the world where you can have these, all three of these onset clusters, but English just rules this one out, possibly because these are both alveolar sounds, and that might make it a little more complex to say. Yeah, so it's interesting when you do actually try to say tle or clamp, people usually hear it as something else like the KL sequence or something like that. But if you do encounter a word that starts with tla, we have to do something about it. So one interesting fact about the part of the world in which we live is that just over on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, back in the old days and to a certain extent in the modern days as well, there were languages there that had lots of consonant clusters in them. And one of those languages was called Tlingit. So I don't know if you've ever tried to say this word, but it starts with this TL combination. And oftentimes people will try to sort of fix that because you can't really say that in English according to the rules of the phonotactic constraints of English. So maybe if you're really good and you're used to it, you just say Tlingit and you get it to work. If not, maybe you're going to do something to fix it, like say put a schwa in between the T and the L, like Tlingit. Or maybe get rid of one of these segments like Lingit or Tlingit or something, I don't know what. You might have encountered this not just in the languages of British Columbia, but other languages as well. So for instance, Russian has a different set of phonotactic constraints than English, so and Greek as well. So the name Dmitry is actually originally Greek, but we know it often as a Russian name too. So Dma is not a sequence you can get in the onset of any English word. What do you do when you actually say Dmitry? Maybe you probably put a schwa in between the D and the M. I remember there used to be a hockey player in the NHL who was Oleg Tverdovsky. His last name started with TV. ER, so on and so forth. And tv is not a legal onset in English either. I remember a lot of hockey announcers would call him Oleg Tverdovsky, so they put an epsilon in the middle there. My wife is Ukrainian, not Russian, but Ukrainian has lots of interesting onset clusters as well as coda clusters. Her name is Svetlana, and you'd be amazed at how people stumble over the pronunciation of her name, including producing it with some sort of not so nice words. But you often hear people say Zilana or whatever. It's just funny what they do. Oftentimes they don't even try. So when we go to restaurants, she just says her name is Lana, which neither of us likes as much, but what are you going to do? Okay, so people are stuck with the rules of the language that they're born into and can only get beyond them to a certain extent. But this is where linguistics helps sort of transcend your personal boundaries a little bit. So let's try another. We got the word arcade, and this one has a little trick in it, which is useful for you to know. So let's look first for the potential nuclei of syllables. So we've got a couple of different vowels in here, but one of them is a diphthong. So we have this A diphthong in the middle here, and I just want you to know that this whole combination forms its own syllable nucleus. So ah is just by itself, but here we have A. Those two branch up into one single nucleus, and that forms one syllable. Okay, so we've got two syllables together here, one anchored by the A, one anchored by the ah. What do we do with the rest? So like I said, when you create syllables, after you get the nuclei, you look to the left to see what can fit in the onset of that syllable. So this is the only syllable that has anything to the left of the nucleus that we can work with. So it grabs the K, and that forms the onset. And if it would, if you're working through this step by step, would take a look at this and say, can I add that on too? But can you think of any word in the English language that begins with an RK and that forms the onset of a first syllable? I don't think you can. So that's not a legal combination in here. If you're worried about what's a legal combination in English, think about what can happen or what you can find at the start of a word where it's kind of clear and not affected by any other syllable boundaries. If you get it there at the beginning of a word, then you can get it at the beginning of an onset or beginning of a syllable somewhere in the middle of the word too. You're not going to get irk at the beginning of a word. You're not going to get it at the beginning of a syllable in the middle of a word here either. So we just get the K latching on to this nucleus. And then after that, we put everything else in the codas of syllables. And these codas move to their left as well. So the is going to latch on to that initial ah. So that'll be R. And then the D latches on to the syllable before it too. So the second syllable is cade. Arcade. Makes sense? Hopefully it does. But either way, these are kind of the new steps we're adding on here. Both halves of a diphthong combined into one nucleus. You can't make an onset out of something you can't find at the beginning of a word. Remaining consonants go into codas. Okay. What combination of consonants can form a possible onset? Like I said, any combo that can be found at the beginning of a word. We can take another example like the thra. We can see at the beginning of a word like three. So if we wanted to syllabify the word arthritic, another example from the quick write, what do we do first? We look for the vowels. We've got an ah, an I, and an I here. So we should have three different syllables, all with vowel nuclei. And then after we form those nuclei, we grab the potential onsets to their left. So thra can form its own onset. That goes together into the onset of that second syllable, and just the T forms the onset of the last syllable there. You have a word beginning with erthra. That just doesn't work in English. I don't know if there's other languages where it does, but we won't worry about them for now. Everything else has to go in the coda to the left of each consonant as well. So the goes with that ah. So we got R, and then the K goes to its left and forms the tick at the tail end. 3 syllables. Okay. Mentioned that before. We'll go through one more example, which is the syllabification of Atlantic. So in this case, the fact that TL and NT can't start words is going to factor into this one. So we've got 3 syllables here, Atlantic. The ed, the ad, the I form their own syllable nuclei. And again, these nuclei are going to look to their left to form onsets. You can't form an onset with the tla. We've talked about that at some length. So the middle syllable just grabs the L. And then the last syllable can only grab the T. It can't grab the NT because that can't start a word in English either. Everything else goes in the coda of the consonant, coda of the syllable to its left. So we've got 3 syllables here, et, lan, tick. Fair enough? Okay. This is going back to the quick write. We've walked through, I think, 4 of these examples already. The only things left are atrocious and astronomy, but maybe you can already see the patterns in those. So the first question on the quick write is, when is the first vowel schwa? And the second question on the quick write is there a difference between the T in atrocious and the T in Atlantic? So because I'm asking this question, you might expect that the answer is yes, and it is. So there's a difference between the T in atrocious and the T in Atlantic. In atrocious, the T here is aspirated. It's either t or maybe it's even affricated, like trosis. Atrocious, it's not easy to say just step by step there. Atrocious, can't even say it as a word anymore. That's atrocious. Anyways, the T in Atlantic is not aspirated. This one is, or it's affricated. This one is not. This one is probably more likely just unreleased, like Atlantic, or maybe even turn it into a glottal stop, like Atlantic. Yeah, the reason is this TR forms the onset of this syllable here. This TL does not form the onset of this syllable here. There's a syllable break between the T and the L, right? So that T is in the coda of the preceding syllable, and this T is in the onset of this syllable. This happens to be a stressed syllable as well, so it gets aspirated. Trocious. I should just stop talking at this point, but hopefully you get the point. When is the first vowel a schwa? This is a quick right answer from a long time ago. I'm sorry I couldn't incorporate one of your answers in this, but circumstances are strange right now, so I'm working with what we got. This person noted that when we get a schwa, like in America, astronomy, atrocious, the first A is just in a syllable all by itself, and what that means is that it's forming the nucleus of that syllable, that first syllable, but there's no coda consonant to it. When you get a coda consonant after it, like in Atlantic, arcade, and arthritic, and we know all the reasons why that those syllables have coda consonants now, that A is not going to form a schwa as its phonetic representation. It becomes more of what we call a full vowel, like F or A in these two cases. Okay, like I said, I hope that you tried the quick write before you actually did this or looked at this lecture. I don't know how many people are going to actually watch this lecture all the way through, especially after all the different ways it said atrocious, but yeah, this is kind of the answer I was looking for. Okay, so like I said, I'll say a little bit about other languages. So phonotactic constraints can become active when words go across language boundaries, when one language borrows a word from another. A kind of easy, quick and dirty example of this is what happens when Spanish borrows words from English or vice versa. So in Spanish, you can't get clusters like spa, sta, or ska that we get in English. And that you might possibly take for granted, but in Spanish that doesn't work. So those for Spanish speakers are as difficult to say as like a tla onset cluster for English speakers. So what happens when you get a word like, say, student, or maybe my name, Steve, in Spanish? What do they do with it? One fix for that is that sometimes they would add like an epsilon to the beginning of the word, and that would kind of glom onto this S, grab it away from this initial syllable, and make another syllable right here. So it's estudent, something like that. And then the T would go as the onset of this second syllable. It's just a fix, sort of like Tverdovsky. Okay, another thing that can happen is that languages can substitute native sounds for non-native sounds. They may also break up sound sequences to satisfy native phonotactics. So I've got kind of an extreme example here where Japanese has borrowed the English phrase birth control, but there's a lot of sequences in here that are not okay with Japanese phonotactics, like especially birth. There's no syllabic R in Japanese, there's no theta, so on and so forth. So instead of birth, they say basu. And then instead of control, because Japanese doesn't want to have this tra sequence here, or for that matter, it doesn't want to have L in a coda slot. The only coda consonant you can get in Japanese, if I'm not mistaken, is N. So they have to fix that. So control goes to kontoru, where both the R and the L turn into flaps, and the L is no longer in coda position to begin with. They break up the TR sequence by adding another O in the middle here. And here is an example of a coda consonant in Japanese, that single N here in kontoru. Yeah, Japanese, there's a lot to talk about with that. I can't get into it all. It's all pretty fascinating, but that's one example of how these things can change. Another is maybe one that you're familiar with. Hawaiian is missing a fair number of sounds that we have in English, like in Merry Christmas. They would translate that as Mele Kalikimaka. So I'm not going to walk through all the steps of what changed here, but it's the same phrase, just translated into Hawaiian phonotactics and phonology. Okay, that's all I've got for tonight. Hopefully that's enough for you guys to work through those phonotactics exercise or syllable structure exercises in the homework. But as always, you can ask questions.